name is Mary Hogan, and I'm the director of the Cora J. Belden Library. This evening's program is co-sponsored by 4 area libraries, the Lucy Robbins Wells Library, the Berlin Peck Library, and the Wethersfield Public Library. We are so happy to have these great collaborations as a way to extend our programming to additional patrons and bring more programming to all of you. It's been a win-win when we've been working together as a team of 4 libraries. Please check our library websites to find more great programs that we have planned over the next few months. We have other representatives from the libraries attending, and I'd like to thank them. It's been great working together. One of these staff members is Michelle Royer from the Lucy Robbins Wells Library, who's head of the Community Services Division and who will be our moderator and will ask a series of questions. And I'm pleased to have the honor of introducing Libby Copeland, who is an award-winning journalist and author who writes from the New York area about culture and science. As a freelance journalist, she writes for such media outlets as the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Atlantic, and Smithsonian Magazine. Her book, The Lost Family: How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are, published by Abrams in 2020, explores the rapidly evolving phenomenon of home DNA testing and its implications for how we think about family and ourselves, and its ramifications for American culture broadly. The Wall Street Journal says it's a fascinating account of lives dramatically affected by genetic sleuthing. The New York Times advises, before you spit in that vial, read this book. The Washington Post says The Lost Family reads like Agatha Christie mystery and wrestles with some of the biggest questions in life. Who are we? What is family? Are we defined by nature, nurture, or both? It was recently named to the Guardian's list of best books of 2020 or last year. Welcome, Libby, and welcome, Michelle.
Thank you. Yeah. So I'm a journalist. I've been a journalist for a little over 20 years. One of the things that I've have been very interested in that's shown up in my work over and over is this question of how we define ourselves, how we arrive at our identities and sort of like how that changes over time and how we kind of construct the selves that we carry with us into the world. And that, that has a lot of tentacles because it's about ethnicity, it's about race, it's about gender, it's about personal narrative. And in addition to that, one of the things that's always interested me is technology and how technology kind of shapes our culture and sometimes shapes the way we see ourselves or the way we behave or our moral compass in ways that we often can't anticipate. So that kind of came together a few years ago. I was writing for the Washington Post a bunch. I was in conversation with my editor, and we were really interested in home DNA testing because home DNA testing is this kind of fascinating technology. It wasn't even available 20 years ago in the way that it is now. And all of a sudden, for this really low price, in this really short amount of time, you can get this unbelievable information about where you came from and your family, sometimes more than you anticipated that you were asking. And when you get that information, and sometimes it is incredibly unexpected, there's this kind of question of like, what now? And there's so many people doing it now and often getting answers to questions they didn't realize they were asking, that, we were kind of fascinated by this phenomenon of technology's unexpected consequences and how this changes.
I'm on a Zoom with the library. For the
and what we did was I wrote a piece for the Washington Post.
Can I talk to you after that?
And if you're not muted, thank you so much. So I wrote a piece for the Washington Post about this phenomenon. And then what happened is got this sort of flood of reader email from people who wanted to share more stories. They were saying, I took a DNA test and like that piece resonated with me that you wrote in the Washington Post. Now, let me tell you my story. And these stories were unbelievable, incredibly intimate and moving stories of people often in middle life who took a test and it really reconfigured how they saw themselves and their world. It actually changed their sense of orientation, right? It kind of changed their sense of where they belonged on the planet. Really profound discoveries about the past, which in many ways isn't over. It kind of shapes us and it shapes how we see ourselves now. And that kind of came together. I was reading these emails. I started talking to people on the phone. I thought, my goodness, this is like a profound change to our culture, because what this really represents is the end of family secrets. It means that there's nobody who does not know the truth about their genetic origins anymore. It means that things that we assumed a generation ago that parents could safely not tell their kids and the kids would never know, whether that was right or wrong, Now that does not exist anymore. And it means that we have entered this age of intergenerational transparency, where we are really reckoning with the truth about how the American family is much more nuanced and complicated than maybe 50, 60 years ago, the kind of social taboos that existed would allow us to admit. And that all kind of came together. I wanted to write about that moment where American culture was changing in such a big way. And those stories came into, became the book, The Lost Family.
That's so interesting how everyone just sort of came to you, once you put it out there. So, we're all ears. So if you want to take over the screen here, and can't wait to hear the rest of it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can just kind of chat. I can kind of talk if you want. And if you have questions, feel free to pop in. But, the way that I basically decided to shape the book was to take a central narrative that would kind of, take you through and form a kind of a story that I was hoping kind of be, fairly compelling, because this is nonfiction and it's, mainstream science and it's about genealogy. But when I'm reading for pleasure, I'm reading whodunits and thrillers. I'm reading like Agatha Christie, sure, and I'm reading like Tana French. That's to me, I want a book that I can consume like candy. So I had this idea that, because I had done enough interviews with people to find that when someone takes a recreational DNA test, and particularly if they discover something about their genetic origins that they weren't expecting, right? Like one of their parents that they thought of as their parents is not genetically related to them, and that someone else, some stranger, has contributed half their genetic material. That when they make a discovery like that, it is essentially like launching on a detective story. Right? It's an existential detective story, because then the question is, who am I? Right? Like, where did I come from? And putting the pieces together is the work sometimes of months, sometimes of years, and sometimes of a lifetime. Making sense of it and processing it and kind of incorporating that into your sense of self, that is an amazing journey, right? And I had this idea that, a genetic detective mystery could be a really good basis for a nonfiction book, but it could have the shape, it could have the kind of feel of an Agatha Christie in a way, because, except that it's true, right? And so I went looking for a story that would be compelling enough, a true story that would be compelling enough that you would keep wanting to turn the pages. And I found this incredible story in this woman named Alice Collins Playbook. And she is a real life woman who lives in Washington State. And she was a genealogist, is a genealogist. She was retired when we meet her. We meet her in 2012. She's in her 60s. And she takes a DNA test kind of just for fun, out of curiosity, without any real sense of the stakes that can be at play. And she believes that she is almost entirely Irish American. So she's grown up in this very strong Irish Catholic culture with this very strong sense of Irish identity. And she's trying to figure out a little bit more about her Irish forebears so that she can trace some of her grandparents back who emigrated from Ireland, which county did they come from? She thinks DNA will help her. And 2012 is in many ways kind of the dawn of the DNA testing era, because while it has been around longer, 2012 is when one of the biggest companies to come on the scene gets into the game, and that company is Ancestry, and they had just debuted their autosomal DNA test. And that's the test that can give you information about your DNA that you inherit from both your parents. And that's a big game changer when they get into this market. So Alice takes this test, and she's very surprised by the results, because the results suggest that she's half Ashkenazi Jewish, so that her genetic ancestry is not from England and Ireland and Scotland like she thought. I mean, mostly Ireland, but also just like a mix of British Isles, but is in fact from Central and Eastern Europe. And specifically Ashkenazi Jews. And she thinks, well, that can't be, that's not it. That's not who I am. So presumably Ancestry doesn't know what they're doing. And it's early days, right? Nobody really knows how good these ethnicity estimates are, that purport to be able to tell you where your people come from. So she's like, okay, well, I'll just take a test with another company and I'll tell Ancestry that, they don't really know what they're doing. So she tests with 23andMe, which is another big company that people have probably heard of, I'm sure. And the 23andMe results confirm that she's half Ashkenazi Jewish. And then she's like, well, okay, how is that? How can that be? And she launches on this investigation. And, the first thing that comes to mind, which I think would come to anyone's mind, is maybe dad isn't genetically my dad, right? And that is actually a really common scenario for people who take a DNA test and get a surprise. One of the most common kinds of surprises. It's so common at this point that there's a lot of kind of acronyms for it. So it's called often an NPE, which stands for non-paternity event, which is kind of an older term used in genealogy. And then it's been kind of recoined as not parent expected, to acknowledge the fact that sometimes it's the case where someone's discovering maybe that they're adopted, right? And both parents aren't genetically related to them, or in some case that their mother isn't genetically related to them. That's much less typical. The father surprise is the most common version of a non-parental event. Sometimes it's called MPE for misattributed parentage experience. But anyway, it's a lot of people at this point, so much so that there are advocacy organizations, nonprofits, educational organizations set up to support people who are experiencing NPEs and MPEs. There are psychologists specializing in it. This is a huge field that literally didn't exist 10 years ago, right? That there was no such misattributed parentage experience arising from a DNA test a decade ago. And now it's close probably to 1 million people who have made this discovery via DNA test. So that's a massive category of people. And Alice figures she's got to be one of them. Then what other explanation could there be for half of her genetic ancestry not being what she expects? And she kind of goes through all the theories of how that could be. She thinks, well, it's probably not the case that I'm donor conceived, but it could be that my mom had a relationship outside marriage. And then she looks into that and she's able to disprove both of them. And she's able to disprove another theory that she has, which is that she's adopted. She has a series about her grandparents that she's able to disprove. She has a theory about maybe she comes from a people who hid their genetic ancestry. So they hid their Jewish ancestry in an attempt to assimilate, to escape discrimination, which is also something that has historically happened with certain populations. And people make that discovery by DNA test in this case sometimes. And she goes through all these theories, and she kind of goes from like most likely to like increasingly far-fetched, and each theory that she confronts, she can disprove. And along the way, the beauty of using Alice as a kind of vehicle for this book, and the other reason I chose her story, in addition to the fact that she's fascinating and compelling, and it's a great story, and she's an amazing human being, is because that as a narrative kind of thread allows me to tell many other stories too. So I can sort of veer off from Alice's story, and I can tell an entire chapter about the phenomenon of non-paternity events, not parent expected. How it is, a number of different experiences, the way it can play out, the way it plays out for the fathers, the way it plays out in terms of reunions and rifts and attempts at reconciliation, right? I tell the story when Alice is exploring the possibility she's adopted. I tell the story of a woman who discovers she's adopted through a DNA test. I tell the story of a man whose people did hide their genetic ancestry to protect them from discrimination. And he takes a DNA test and learns that he is biracial. And he had thought he was white and Sicilian. And his mother had told him that he was Sicilian because she was trying to protect him from the knowledge that, in fact, he was part Black, and she had faced such discrimination as a biracial child that she didn't want him to experience that too. So because she could pass and he could pass, she made that decision to have him not know. And through DNA and genealogy, he made this discovery and sort of has launched on this incredible journey of getting to know his people, getting to know his relatives, getting to know his true history, and kind of the way that America has shaped his family story and all its complications and its cruelties, but also, there's a blessing to it for him as well. So anyway, Alice's story kind of takes us through all those theories, and we get to veer off and see what it looks like when other people make discoveries where that theory does hold true. And ultimately, I won't reveal what happens, but ultimately none of those things hold water. And after several years of investigation, full-time investigation, and she's tireless and amazing and really, really smart, she discovers the explanation for her unexpected results. And it turns out to be this kind of shocking historical anomaly that goes back 100 years. And so the part of the beauty of writing the book was getting to kind of do the historical research going back a century and kind of place you in those circumstances and tell that particular fascinating American story that shaped Alice. And, along the way, we get to know Alice and her family, and, the way that a revelation about your roots can shape how you see yourself. And that kind of takes us back to, the thing that drew me to writing The Lost Family, which is this idea that, the things that are contained in these vials of saliva, the news, the understanding of the past, has the power to shape the present and has the power to reshape how we think about concepts like ethnicity, about concepts like fatherhood, concepts like selfhood and the self that we carry into the world. It has the power to change the person that we see in the mirror. And that's a pretty amazing thing for a product that is, relatively inexpensive and marketed as recreational. So I think we're in a pretty remarkable world. And that's sort of a sense of how Alice's story kind of carries us through that world.
So how many people would you say have started to do this in the United States or within the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so when I started writing my book, it was 4 years ago, and there were 8 million DNA test kits sold. And now there are almost 40 million.
Wow.
And the majority of them are in the United States. The 4 companies, by the way, just to kind of like ground us in the landscape, the big 4 recreational DNA testing companies for ancestry purposes are Ancestry, which is the biggest, 23andMe, which a lot of people know because they also do health testing, MyHeritage, and a company called Family Tree DNA, which is the oldest of the 4. It was actually the first company in the US and to start this field, and they started it 21 years ago down in Texas.
So of the 40 million people that have, 40 million people that have done this, what has been the response? Like, what are all these people who now have sons and daughters and nieces and nephews or parents that didn't want to be parents?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, I should say, most people take a test and the results they get are pretty much in line with what they expect, right? And that's what happened for me. We made some pretty astonishing and incredible genealogical discoveries along both my mom's side and my father's side that have reunited us with cousins that we didn't know existed, and has kind of enlarged our family and made the world smaller. But we didn't find anything that kind of threatened our idea of some sacred narrative in the family, right? Like, a lot of families, there's this phenomenon where they have an idea about the patriarch, for instance, that he was always loyal to my mom, and he was, I love my dad, and then he's great and he's such a family man, and then the test reveals that he had a child outside the marriage, right? And that's a big reason why these things are so upsetting, because we have these narratives about our families, and these really threaten those. These are family secrets that were secret for a reason, because they suggest that somebody wasn't faithful, or they suggest things that years ago at least were major league stigmas and taboos about somebody who had a child at 16 when they weren't married, things that in an earlier time at least would have been seen as quite shameful, and people had to make decisions to basically survive. That meant that there were certain things they could never talk about, right? Or children that they placed for adoption, they never told anyone. They never even told their husbands when they got later. So then the revelation of that coming 55 years later is often very, very much of a mixed blessing for the person on the other side, because on the one hand, this may be a woman who has always yearned to know her child and to know that her child is okay. And at the same time, never told her husband, right? And so that's really tough. And it can kind of reconfigure how people see each other. So I mean, I would say the majority of people don't, majority of people kind of, this is an augmentation of their genealogical research. They go, that's really interesting. I didn't know my grandfather was from such and such place. Maybe it allows them to make a heritage trip or, get to know some cousins they didn't know about, right? And then there's like a significant subset of people who are discovering they're not related to dad. They have a first cousin they didn't know about. They have an older half sister, 20 years older. No one ever told them that they had this half sister, and it is a very different experience depending on what the revelation is to you. So, I interviewed a lot of people who took a test and they found out something surprising about their own genetic origins. And that is a really often traumatic revelation, to find out that half of you is made of a stranger. And that often feels like a betrayal. And there's often a sense of trust that is maybe broken or threatened, trust in one's parents if you make this discovery and they knew and you didn't, right? And then there's often a process of seeking and wanting to know more about, say, the genetic father, right? And maybe you love your dad, the man who raised you, but you also want to know this other man, whatever you want to call him. And maybe you want to have a relationship with him if he'll get to know you, and kind of broaden your family in that way. And that can be really painful and take a long time. But every single person I ever interviewed who made a discovery about their own genetic origins said to me, I wouldn't unknow it if I could. Even when it was painful, I'm glad to know because it's the truth. And I want to understand the context for how I came to be. I want, this answers questions, it explains things. There's that memory I had when I was 6 that I just am remembering now, and it completely makes sense now. And like, I understand the dynamics and why my dad said this one thing and my mother treated me this way and my brothers always felt different. And, it really contextualizes things for these people who make these discoveries about themselves. And they often do want to connect with newfound biological family members. That's not always true for the people on the other side, right? The people who, maybe the secret keepers, the man who didn't know he had a child, or maybe he did, the man who donated sperm in 1975 and helped conceive 10 children and now doesn't really want to connect with these children because he doesn't know what kind of relationship he wants with them, or maybe he does, right? And people react very, very differently. And there's a kind of a collision often. It's almost got two things on collision courses. One is kind of the contemporary culture, right? The culture that we live in, that we swim in, which is, a culture that kind of values transparency and authenticity and, the full truth, right? And kind of working out your feelings and looking to the past to understand the context for the present, and, memoirs and therapists and blogs and like podcasts and intimacy and all that kind of normalizing all that kind of stuff that a long time ago was not normalized and not spoken about. So that's the culture we swim in. And the culture that led to these profound family secrets where children didn't know where they came from, that is a vastly different culture, right? That's a culture often of taboos and the threat of social ostracization, and like some things aren't done. And those decisions to keep those secrets basically stay suspended in that old cultural context. They're almost like staying suspended in amber over the course of many decades. And they still carry with them all those old emotional landscape of shame, embarrassment, guilt, fear, anger, whatever the circumstances were. So what you have in this moment in 2021, when someone takes a test, is they're not just making a discovery, they are actually taking a rocket ship back to 1962 or whenever they were conceived. And it is very hard to put yourself in that mind space or to understand what the stakes were, or to say to your mom how, to understand why your mom, say, made a certain decision not to tell you because now you're living in this world, right? So there's a collision of cultures, the culture of the present and the culture of the past. And the other collision that you see a lot of is between my right to know who I am, my right to know my genetic identity, and your right to privacy, or your right not to be known. And you see that a lot too with the older generation of either the father who knew or didn't know he had a child out there, or the mother who, you know, knew that her child was actually, you know, his father was actually somebody else other than the man who helped raise that child. And that is also on a collision course of like whose interests should predominate, you know, and how much are you entitled to know about yourself, when the question about who you are is also predicated on something that I did 60 years ago, right? So those things kind of are all coming to the fore right now in this moment, and it's very fraught. And part of what I wanted to do in the last family was tell some of those stories, 360s of families, you know, the stories where the father embraces the child and the stories where he doesn't, and validate and normalize some of those experiences, because people in America are experiencing every single one of those things and more right now.
Wow, we just had a comment in the chat just about what you were just speaking about.
Let's see, what does it say?
The privacy.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting to read about who has the right to privacy, the parent who wants to stay anonymous or the child who wants to know who her parent is. Yeah. I mean, there's a kind of a saying that there's a genetic genealogist with a say, he has a saying that's something along the lines of like the parent doesn't have the right not to be known, but they have the right to not have a relationship. But, you know, that idea that you don't have the right not to be known, that is one of the real lessons of the DNA age, which we can talk about, which is that because so many people are in the databases, that everyone is essentially discoverable in the United States now, whether or not they're in the database or not, to someone who's genetically related to them and trying to identify them. In other words, no one is invisible, even if you haven't taken a test, because we share segments with people who are in the system, right? And if you follow the case of the Golden State Killer, who was that serial killer who was identified and arrested a few years ago through the use of genetic genealogy databases, you know, he was somebody who not taken a DNA test, but he was able to be identified. And the reason that he's able to be identified is because his distant cousins he never heard of, third cousins, second cousins, were in the databases. So if you, for instance, were a sperm donor in 1970, right? And let's say you don't know it, but you have like 8 biological children out there. You might assume that you could not be found by them by not taking a DNA test. In fact, you can be, absolutely, and probably will be, because you already have a third or second cousin or a few in the database. And because of the power of DNA combined with genealogical research, combined with social media, those children can probably identify you by doing research and then figuring out that you're, you know, at least one of 2 brothers is their biological dad. And so that means that in some ways, almost every American is kind of impacted by this technology, at least in a potential sense. And it means that, you know, we all kind of have to grapple with this stuff because we know our information isn't as private as we imagine. You know, we're all implicated by this technology. You may discover something about your health or your family or yourself because of DNA testing, even though you never actually took a test yourself, right? And so on a purely logistical level, that's part of why I think DNA testing is really interesting and important. Just because America's saturated this so much, or it's saturated us, I guess, I don't know. But the other reason I think that this topic is really interesting, and you know, the reason I think that, you know, like I could probably write 6 books about this because it's just so rich, is because it's like these questions about who am I, right? Which is of course what I always come back to. The DNA age makes those questions really kind of personal and dramatic. And we've all engaged with those questions, whether you've taken a DNA test, whether you've wondered about any of this or not. Every single one of us, because we are human beings, has thought about this question of like, what makes me me? You know, and how much of me is like due to my parents, how much of me is due to like I don't know, like, you know, experiences outside of that, you know, how much is it biology, how much of is it, right, the nature versus nurture thing. And it's all those questions about the human condition, right? And like what makes us who we are, go back through time. Like you can sort of see that in literature, and you can see it in the record, that human beings have kind of pondered those things. And now there are, you know, millions of Americans who previously might have thought about that in the abstract, who are now thinking about it in you know, quite close up and real in terms of their own selves and their own families. And that's like a huge big deal.
So how does, just for, you know, I'm new to some of this and I'm sure other people are too. So how, you know, I know you talk a little bit about the science of it in your books and how the company started and how they were able to track things. Is that something you can tell us more about?
Yeah, how the company started. So yeah, there's this company down in Houston, Texas, Family Tree DNA. They started 21 years ago. They sort of helped start the field. There was one other company in the UK that started around the same time and is no longer around. But the Family Tree DNA was started by a genealogist. And he had this idea that, like, basically he had a theory in his own family. He had a brick wall, and he was trying to prove that this guy was maybe related to him, this like distant potential relative living all the way in Argentina. Might have been related to him through Eastern Europe at some point. And he, you know, got to a point where their paper record couldn't help him anymore. And he figured DNA could, but there were no DNA tests on the market. And the reason he even thought of it was because he was reading scientific papers where they were saying, like, the lineage of certain men as, you know, established by their Y DNA, Y chromosome, which is passed down from a man to his son, and then from that son to his son, right? And all the way down like that. And in the 90s, there were some scientists who were doing work studying Y DNA among a particular community of Jews known as the Kohanim. So he was reading these papers and he was like, I wonder if I could use this in my own research. And his name is Bennett Greenspan. He like actually went so far as to call a scientist whose name he saw on top of one of these papers, these academic papers, and like asked the guy, like on a Sunday at home, he called him, he found his number in the white pages. And he was like, I want to get my hands on one of those DNA tests you use in the lab. And the guy was like, that's crazy. We don't sell it. This is serious science. Who are you? And Bennett Greenspan was like, I'm a genealogist. And what about we go into business together? He convinced the guy after some time there was a market out there because there were enough obsessive genealogists like him, like Bennett, to purchase these things. And what they did was they did go into business, and it was like really small for a really long time because it was looking at the DNA in the Y chromosome and something called mitochondrial DNA. And it was like not that informative compared to what we do now with autosomal DNA. It was giving you a sense of your ancient roots and your ancient migration paths. And it wasn't really that useful in terms of like more recent generations or finding cousins and things like that. And so it was this niche product for people like him, right? You know, obsessive genealogists. And then autosomal DNA comes on the scene, and Ancestry gets involved, and Ancestry starts marketing and advertising. And this becomes basically this product for rootless Americans. Right? It becomes something that's not even just about genealogists anymore. It's just like casual consumers who are like, I'll just give this to my kid as a gift for the holidays. Or like, I'll just give it to my wife or whatever. Like, it's like, I don't know what to get them. Here's a gift for the person in your life who already has everything. It's on sale. It was only $59, right? So then it becomes almost this back door to genealogy for a lot of people. And for some people, a backdoor to unexpected discoveries about their own immediate family. So it really goes from something that has a very, very high bar to entry because it is hundreds of dollars in the beginning, and it's very hard to understand. You have to have a lot of kind of technological know-how to navigate. It goes from being this thing that's like very few people are going to want to do it to everyone's doing it. And that's a complete transformation, and it has huge implications.
I think we have something else in the chat to look at. Let's see. This is from Kelly.
So yeah, so right, and she's talking about this idea of who has the right to privacy, right? And she says, my brother fathered a child in the Panama Canal Zone in the early 60s. I told this person she had to be my niece, no doubt. Yeah, I mean, that's happening all the time now. And then there's this question of like, what do you do with that information, right? Is that person family? And there's no like right or wrong answer to that. I mean, everyone kind of answers that question for themselves. Some people really want to embrace newfound family members, get to know them, very excited. Other people don't. And that is a whole kind of thing that's playing out as well.
Okay. I have a couple other questions here. So what did your research reveal about the implications of home DNA testing for African American communities, given the history of slavery in the United States?
Yeah, that's a
America.
great, yeah. So just in general, right? DNA testing, home DNA testing can be really, really helpful for people for whom the records are not forthcoming. Either they don't exist, or they can't access them. And there's a lot of communities like that for a variety of reasons, right? So for instance, in the US, if your donor conceived, your sperm donor might have been anonymous, right? And then how do you know who he is if you want to know? DNA testing. You may be adopted, and you may be in a state where you are restricted from accessing your original birth certificate, and your birth certificate would contain the names of your birth parents, but you're not allowed to know it. What do? DNA testing, right? If you want to know. And so there's like a lot of different kind of reasons, right? African Americans are also a fascinating example of this, where there is these entrenched historical reasons where the kind of cruelties of history then get compounded by the lack of any records. So, if your ancestors' humanity was taken from them, then your ancestors' identities are taken from you. How incredibly displacing and frustrating to know that your people were brought over in chains. And then on top of it, you don't even know exactly where they were brought over from. It's like this incredible breach in history. It's like a huge black hole. And for this community, you cannot, it can be very difficult to follow the line back, because for instance, let's say you're following your great grandmother through the records, let's say you're following her through the federal census, and she was enslaved during slavery, and so you've got her in the 1870s federal census, and you try to track her during the time of slavery. So you try to go back to 1860 and find her. You may not be able to find her because during slavery, the federal census didn't name people who were enslaved. Like, they lost their names. They were just tick marks in a box. So then how do you follow her? You don't even know where she went, right? And there's a lot of examples of that, where there may be some records, but because of a lot of records are missing, and because a lot of them are really hard to track, or because families are being separated, with children sold into the deep South away from their parents, or there's not a lot of good records where you can track what ship they came over from and what country they were brought over from. There's all this kind of lack of knowledge, and then DNA can fill the gaps. So, I tell in my book, The Lost Family, I tell a number of stories of African-American genealogists who've been able to do incredible things with DNA combined with genealogy that they couldn't do from the record alone. So there's one family, for instance, that is able to confirm the story of, have an oral history that's passed down, that one of their ancestors was enslaved and had a child by her white enslaver. And that they were able to confirm that story through DNA, and they were able to figure out the white man's identity. And then they were able to find a white cousin who was descended from that white man and his white wife. And that cousin didn't know as many white Americans don't know what their family's sort of involvement was in slavery, that cousin didn't know. But this African American family couldn't help but know. That, to me, I wrote an op-ed about this in the New York Times back in March. To me, there's really interesting about the way the DNA age can reconcile white Americans to the realities of the past. You know, DNA testing is very complicated. There's privacy concerns and people feel very differently about it, and for good reason. And there's a lot of ways in which you don't know what's coming. There are cautionary tales for sure, but it strikes me that in some ways there's also this opportunity to be more clear-eyed about the past because of this. There's a story in the book about an African-American genealogist who he's able to actually discover exactly where he came from along certain branches of his tree in Africa because he discovers present-day African cousins in the databases. So these are people whose forebears never came over, right? They stayed. They were not forced into slavery, but they stayed in Africa. And because of these present day cousins, he's able to get a much more precise sense of who his people were. And along one branch in particular, the cousin says to him, listen, you know, our people weren't just from this particular area geographically, they were part of this particular community. And he gives them the name of the community. It's a group of people called the Fulani. And this genealogist, whose name is T.L. Dixon, he then is able to like really hone in on what the lives of his ancestors were like as part of that community, because he can look them up and he can research them and he can read papers on them, right? And so that's like an incredible gift to somebody who otherwise wouldn't be able to access that information and that opportunity for self-knowledge.
Wow. Somebody just put in the chat, I think it's Kelly, that, you know, just sounds like another book. You know, like you said, you can go on and on and on in different areas. Wow, that's just unbelievable. What can happen, you know?
Yeah, there's 1,000 stories. I mean, part of the challenge of writing a book was choosing which stories to tell, because there were so many and there were a number that I had to cut for space that were really incredible. And even when I handed it in to my editor, this is my first book. He was like, that's great, it's good, but it's way too long. Now cut, like, I think it was like a quarter of it, you know? Wow. So I had to cut it from, I think it was 135,000 words down to 100,000. And it was like cutting off fingers. I mean, right now, you know, you could throw a rock and hit an amazing story about, you know, DNA testing in the past and how we're understanding ourselves better now because of it, right? Or facing ourselves in ways that we didn't have to before. So there's a lot happening right now because of that.
And when you're talking about what's going on now, what do you think the next step will be in all this? What do you think happens next with DNA?
I mean, it's interesting because there's a lot about this technology that is unforeseen in terms of its consequences. So if you look back at the history of this technology, there was never, I think, the anticipation that it would play out in this way for people discovering things about their immediate families, right? I mean, in some way there was, because the companies would get these phone calls from people who would say, I don't understand. I'm looking at my DNA relatives and it says I have a half sister, but I only have one brother. So you guys must have mixed up my vial with someone else. Maybe, you know, I took the test at the same time as my husband. Maybe you swapped our vials. You know, people would say that, right? And the companies got used to these calls and they actually had to train people to take these special sensitive calls. So on a certain level, they knew that this was happening. On another level, I don't think they knew the scale of it for some time, right? I don't think in the very beginning, particularly Greenspan, the guy who started Family Tree DNA, you know, understood the scale of what this really meant in terms of our understanding of the family and American culture. The founder, one of the co-founders of 23andMe, Anne Wojcicki, has talked about the idea that she didn't really understand until a certain point how much her tests and the results that people were giving were really grappling with people's ideas around race and potentially reinforcing really problematic ideas around race, or potentially negating those problematic ideas. Well, which was it? You know, and I think the jury is out on that. I talk about that a lot in the book too. Does this reinforce our sense of genetic difference, which it shouldn't, because everything we know suggests how identical we are. But the way that you get that news, when you get that pie chart, and when you take a test from a company like Ancestry, it tends to suggest that we are quite different. We're even able to be subdivided into different colors of pie, you know? And so sometimes it's possible people are walking away with more of a sense of how different we all are and how kind of, firm these boundaries are, which they're really not. It's quite a continuum. So there's a lot that was unanticipated in the beginning. And another thing that was unanticipated was the idea that police would be able to access some of the information in some of these private databases to solve cold cases, right? And that is a whole other kind of thing that is threatening some of these companies and threatening to some of these family history researchers and consumers who feel that that's a privacy concern. And some companies cooperate, some companies don't. And if you have concerns about that, research it, because the companies behave very differently with regard to whether law enforcement has access. And that's very important to know. Most of the companies don't permit law enforcement access. And then there's this other question, right? So where's it going, right? How is this going to affect insurance in the future if this information ever gets out? If this information gets out and is the topic of a hack or a breach, subject of a breach, is that going to compromise you, right? How informative is the information about you? How informative is the information about your health? These are kind of open questions that have yet to be resolved. How will this be used for crimes in the future? Will this be used for small petty crimes? What are the kind of guardrails around it? And then there's this other question, which is sort of, where is this technology going? Some companies, namely Ancestry, have kind of doubled down on the idea that this is really for family history research. They offer subscription access to their genealogical database. And a lot of people who take a DNA test through Ancestry it's like a gateway drug, and they find that they're actually really kind of obsessed with the genealogical questions, and then they have to subscribe, and before you know it, they're going down the rabbit hole, and you know, it's really fulfilling, and I know what it's like because I've gone through it, and that's how Ancestry is making their money, right? They're selling kits, but they're also selling these subscriptions. 23andMe has gone in a different direction. They're seeing this as a lucrative field in terms of health research and drug development. So that's a completely different path. And they're both worth billions of dollars. So, you know, one of the questions will be where this is all going. We have some comments on the chat, I think. Kelly, thank you, Kelly. She said, you did a fantastic job telling every story you told in your book. It was thoroughly riveting. Thank you so much. You're my super fan, and your check is in the mail. And somebody else says, what was that acronym you mentioned at the beginning of the meeting for support groups and the industry that's grown from this? So there's NPEs and MPEs, and they all kind of mean the same thing. It's non-paternity event, or not parent expected, or misattributed parentage experience, and there are other terms, but these are some of the main terms for the discovery that one or both of your parents is not genetically related to you, typically dad. And there's a group called the MPE Friends Fellowship. There's a group called Right to Know, which is about genetic identity. There's a group called the MPE Collective, and I'm butchering the name, but it's a group of psychologists that treat people going through these situations. There's a wonderful organization called Watershed, which is run by a genetic counselor down in Virginia, where she works with people who go through NPEs and MPEs, and she runs groups. There's Facebook groups for people who are experiencing NPEs and MPEs. So if you find out, you know, tomorrow you take a DNA test, and you find out dad's not genetically related to you, you are in good company, right? And there's podcasts about it. I mean, I think one of the big goals of this era is to normalize this experience, which people, you know, they have it, they don't know how common it is, they might feel embarrassed. They may not want to talk about it. This is an incredibly common experience. And the more that we talk about it, the more we normalize it, the better I think we will be. Somebody said, I'm less concerned about hacks than I am concerned about them just outright selling this data to other companies for nefarious activities. What did you learn about that in your research? I think there's, it's a mixed bag. I mean, the bigger companies do tend to know that their reputations are on the line. And so to a good extent, if not, maybe perfect, or maybe we can't predict the future, but to a solid extent, they're, as a matter of business, good business practice, they're in a position where they want to ask your permission and get it. And so a company like 23andMe, they're asking, will you consent to have your genetic information used for research? And most of their customers say yes. Now, whether those customers really understand how it's being used, is another question, because sometimes what will happen is they'll announce some big deal and people are like, how dare they, right? But in fact, people have actually, those people whose DNA is being used in an aggregated and anonymized way, according to the company. So they're not, in an ideal setting, being compromised, and they're using this information to crowdsource genetic research that hopefully helps people with various health conditions well into the future. And a lot of people are happy about that. As far as sales, I mean, I have not seen evidence that any of the major companies have done that. But, law enforcement accessing databases where the companies didn't disclose that, or didn't, tell their consumers about that, or it was in violation of the agreement they had with their consumers, that's happened. And there are also, I write in the book that, it's a bit of a wild west. There are these companies on the fringes, with, websites rife with misspellings where they say, we'll tell you if your husband's cheating on you, send in the cigarette butt you found in the backyard. It's like, don't do it, because I have no idea what's happening with that cigarette butt and the DNA on it. And there's no consent form on their website, and there's no privacy policy, and there's no protection. So it really is like a kind of a wild west on the fringes of this industry. And there's another person who said, I have tested and did have my parents test before they passed, and have made so many amazing discoveries because of DNA testing, but I do almost wait for something unexpected to pop up at some point. Me too. I have discovered that my great-grandmother was illegitimate and no one in the family ever knew. It made her seem even more real to me, and I find her book so compelling. Her first story so compelling, can't wait to read your book. Yeah, I'm at the point where I think like every family is impacted by one of these kind of, revelations. I just think it's a matter of time before everyone finds one of these secrets, or they're able to help with a person who's adopted, maybe your DNA is going to help somebody find their birth mom. You just don't know. Maybe you're the fourth cousin to that birth mom, and you're the secret, link that's going to help. So yeah, I think every kind of family is impacted at this point, if you kind of, look broadly enough. And I'm glad for you that you made these amazing discoveries because of your DNA research. I mean, even though I'm a journalist who's kind of aware of the complications of this field, I'm also someone who's had like my DNA tested by 3 different companies, and we've done a lot of genealogy, and we've made some really remarkable discoveries because of DNA combined with genealogy. And I wouldn't want to unknow those things. And it's made my family story richer. So I really relate to that, the way that DNA can kind of open up your genealogical journey.
All right. Well, is there anything else you want to get into, or do you want to take a couple more questions? How are you thinking right now?
I'm gonna, if anyone wants to type maybe one more question, I can take it. I am putting here. So one of the things I'm trying to do, and I've been doing this for a long time because my book tour started during the pandemic and continues during the pandemic, is I'm supporting a local bookstore in New York near my house. And they will ship to Connecticut, and you can get a signed copy from them if you want. So I'm putting that in the chat. And if you want a copy of the book from Amazon, you can do that too. The book just came out in paperback, so it's ridiculously cheap, through Jeff Bezos, if that's your jam, and I don't judge. The last thing I'll say is, if you do want to support a local bookstore, but you don't want to, or I mean, whatever, you're in Connecticut, check out bookshop.org. If you're, support your local library too. But there's this, I'm just going to write bookshop.org in there too. So bookshop.org is a consortium of independent bookstores that wants to make it as easy to order from as it is to order from Amazon. And what they'll do is they'll source, my understanding is they'll source the book to a bookstore near your house and then ship it to you. And it's not quite as cheap as Amazon because it, might be like $2 or $3 more, and you may have to pay for shipping. But you're supporting an actual physical bookstore and you're helping keep the doors open during the pandemic. So I think that's really pretty cool. So I put that in the chat too, bookshop.org, if you want to check that out. And somebody wrote, not a question, but the being a helper aspect is so true. I'm currently trying to help a cousin who knows her father was a sperm donor, and everyone buy and read this book. Kelly, again, I'll send another check. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. And the thing about doing genetic genealogy, which is the term for kind of putting these skills of genealogy and DNA understanding together, is that you get bitten by the bug and you get really good at it if you have the kind of mind that can do this. And it sounds like Kelly does. And all of a sudden you have this incredible skill and people come to you and they're like, listen, I don't understand. Can you help me figure this out? Who is the second cousin? Why does it say I have a half sister? I don't know who my dad is. And it's like you have a magic power. And people who have figured this out for themselves, they can kind of help other people. And it's kind of a beautiful thing then, because people become sort of organically become search angels for one another, and they volunteer their time to help them solve their mysteries and understand who they are. And it's just kind of wonderful.